I am a shaman. My father's son, wielding his masks, knowing his ways. I can do this, Kalunga. I know I can.
In an ocean of new action platformers, it's easy to overlook Tales of Kenzera, Zao, but casting it away without a second thought would be a mistake. This is a short, sweet, side-scrolling action game inspired by the many, many children of Metroid and Castlevania. It's full of crunchy combat and springy platforming, all of which is fun, if not groundbreaking, in a genre where others seem to raise the bar on a regular basis. But most importantly, it's the touching love letter from a grieving son to their deceased father, told in clever and moving allegories about sending restless spirits to the afterlife that helps it stand out in the pack.
A sickness plagued him. You have taken his soul, and I am here to reclaim it back.
The biggest first impression Tales of Kenzera makes is how great it looks. With a bold color palette and dynamic environments like lush jungles and rolling hills, finding a screenshot of this game that looks anything less than beautiful would take an act from a spiteful god. Though some of the human characters have clunky or stilted animations, the monsters you'll fight move with a supernatural gait that is fitting for restless spirits, but also useful for clearly identifying when to attack and when to dodge. Tales of Kenzera's African inspirations don't stop at its looks. Its story of a shaman named Zao that must usher restless spirits into the afterlife, itself being told as a story within a story about the loss of a loved one, is rich with parables about surviving through grief. This is a common refrain in much of the ancestor-worshipping mythology of Central and East African people, where death, though painful, can be a rite of passage. Besides being a solid representation of a culture that goes underrepresented in fiction outside of royal cats fighting over space rocks, it's also an extremely personal tale about a son losing his dad, inspired by director Abu Bakr Salim's own relationship with his late father. The simple, delicate, and poignant ways that Tales of Kenzera speaks to loss is one that will stay with me for a long time after any specific platforming sections or enemies fade from my memory.
I think he wanted to make sure he had a good story to tell his son.
This is partially because of how well each of the three big sections entwine the actual game mechanics with those larger themes. For instance, the key ability gained during a section that involves climbing a volcanically active mountain to chase the great spirit of humanity is one that lets your indomitable human will run through walls like a charging bull. But it's also effective thanks to how well written and acted the sparse cast of characters is, especially Zao himself and Kalunga, the god of death who is more wise uncle than Grim Reaper.
All I see before me is a boy. A desperate boy with a desperate plea.
On the other hand, the action of this roughly 6-hour adventure through the exotic land of Kenzera meets modern Metroidvania standards, but rarely exceeds them. Each zone is jam-packed with platforming sequences that don't really test your reflexes or abilities, with the exception of some optional sections that limit checkpoints and push the pace for some sort of reward. I enjoyed all of the dashing, diving, and wall jumping in Tales of Kenzera, but there are very few standout moments, let alone when compared to the impressive areas of contemporaries like Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown. There's a distinct lack of collectible chasing in Tales of Kenzera too. That might bum out folks who enjoy the treasure hunting aspect of Metroidvanias, but I quite enjoyed the trade-off of having to do much less backtracking through winding paths I've already explored. And some findables do exist, like echoes, which are voice notes for unexplored lore bits. I just didn't feel much incentive to stick around any particular place simply to find them. Approachability seems to be the main focus here, and I think Tales of Kenzera succeeds in that regard. Combat is simple but satisfyingly quick and impactful. Zao's Shaman Mask grant him powers of the moon and the sun, which have ranged and melee focuses respectively. You can switch back and forth between them instantly to adapt to whatever the encounter calls for, usually breaking color-coded shields to open monsters up for big damage. As a fan of Housemarque's Outland from 2014, I was happy to see this mechanic return in an evolved and more refined form. The moon and the sun have other unique abilities as well, be it shooting hovering enemies or sending airborne baddies crashing back down to the ground. Enemy variety is rather small, but the monsters are all pretty different from one another, and they are introduced at a gradual pace. That includes things like this tanky boy that's near invulnerable head-on, or these bug-like things that drain life from all creatures in the area, friend or foe. In the latter half of the campaign, the synergies between these enemies add an extra challenge that is by no means controller breaking, but are still clever enough to force tactical thinking and prioritization. Zhao doesn't have many skills to choose from, and the skill tree itself is limited, but after the first tier of upgrades, I didn't feel like I was truly missing out on much. You get all of his vital skills through progressing the story, such as Kabili, which allows you to hover across gaps, or the Zawadi grappling hook. And a few of them even have some value both in and out of fights. For example, the same cerulean spear that can freeze waterfalls into walls to kick off of can also freeze enemies and open them up to free damage. That said, freezing enemies and then nailing them with Zhao's big spirit attacks really trivialize some encounters towards the endgame. This includes some of the bosses, who are high in spectacle but low in difficulty, with fights that end up being pretty similar to one another. I wish there were more of the Spirit Journey trials, which are sets of enemy gauntlets that were consistently the most demanding fights available, forcing me to mix all of my skills and know how to survive. The worst thing I can say about Tales of Kenzera Zhao is that its platforming and level designs are fun, clearly inspired by some of the best Metroidvanias around, but don't really produce any moments that rival those inspirations. Its combat, though also simple and familiar, manages to sing thanks to small but meaningfully different offerings of skills and enemies. And that action is ultimately just a satisfying break from the main attraction, a truly moving tale about how to go on in this world when your loved ones have passed on to the next.
Take your time, Zuberi.
For more side-scrolling action, check out our reviews of Pepper Grinder or Astra Knights of Veda. And for everything else, keep it right here on IGN.